He didn't look at her the way men usually did. No lingering smile, no spark of hunger, no polite lie. He looked at her like she was a fact, solid, unavoidable. When he said her name instead of her sister's, the world seemed to tilt. The yard went quiet. Breath caught in throats, and the woman nobody ever chose felt something crack open inside her chest. Not joy, not yet, just shock and fear. And the terrible question she'd lived with all her life. Why me? Wyoming Territory, spring of 1857. The snow had finally loosened its grip on the high country, retreating into swollen creeks and soggy meadows. The mountains around Alder Ridge Trading Post still wore white crowns, but down in the valley, mud ruled everything. Boots sank deep, wagon wheels groaned. The place smelled of wet pine, old smoke, and tired hope. Alder Ridge had once mattered. Trappers used to crowd the porch. Wagons heading west stopped to trade. Now the roof sagged, the porch leaned, and the windows were patched more than they were whole. Widow Eliza Moreland stood inside the main room, staring at the account book like it might suddenly forgive her debts. It didn't. Her husband had been dead 3 winters now, lost to cold and whiskey and a storm he never should have walked into. Since then, everything had been slipping. Slowly, quietly, like water draining from a cracked barrel. She had 2 daughters, and only one real chance left. Emma Moreland was that chance. At 22, Emma moved through the frontier like it was a ballroom floor. Blonde hair that caught the light, blue eyes that softened men before she ever spoke. She wore her prettiest dress even on muddy days and somehow kept it clean. When she laughed, men leaned closer without realizing they'd moved. Beauty was scarce out here. Emma knew exactly what that meant. Then there was Ruth. At 26, Ruth was already invisible to most of the territory. A faint, dark mark curved along her left cheek, easy to notice, and just as easy to look away from. A childhood snakebite had left her with a limp that worsened when she was tired. She didn't decorate herself, didn't flirt, didn't pretend. She worked. While Emma entertained visitors in the main room, Ruth kept the place alive. She managed supplies, salted meat, balanced books, grew herbs behind the post, and knew what each one could heal. When something broke, Ruth fixed it. When something ran out, Ruth noticed first. No one ever came for her. Eliza knew the truth of their situation. The trading post wouldn't last another winter. The debts would swallow the land. Their only escape was marriage. A good one. A man with means. And men came for girls, like Emma. So when word arrived that a mountain man named Cole Mercer was riding in, Eliza felt hope for the first time in months. Everyone knew Cole Mercer. Late 30s. Trapped the high country north of Split Rock Pass. Quiet, successful, owned good horses. Paid in real coin. He wanted a wife, not for romance, but for order. Someone who could survive where he lived. The post buzzed with preparation. Eliza had the table scrubbed. The good cups brought out. A venison stew set to simmer. Emma disappeared to dress. Ruth was sent to gather herbs and split kindling. No one thought to call her inside. The horse arrived late afternoon. One horse, steady, unhurried. Cole Mercer rode into the clearing like he belonged there. Tall, lean, sun-darkened skin, a beard threaded with gray, buckskin worn soft by years of use. He moved with the calm economy of a man who wasted nothing. Not steps, not words. His eyes were dark, watchful, not unkind, just closed. Eliza greeted him. Food was served beneath the cottonwood. Emma sat where the light touched her hair just right. She smiled. He nodded. She spoke. He answered briefly. She laughed. He ate. He was polite, but distant. His eyes wandered, measuring the land, the buildings, the quiet signs of struggle. Then he noticed movement near the woodpile. Ruth was stacking split logs, sleeves rolled, braid coming loose. Her limp was worse than usual. She worked anyway. She always did. Cole watched her longer than he realized. "Who's that?" he asked. Eliza blinked. "My eldest, Ruth. She runs most things." He nodded once, said nothing more. When the meal ended, Cole stood. "I should be clear why I came," he said. Emma leaned forward slightly. Eliza held her breath. "I'm looking for a wife. I don't offer comfort or ease. I offer work. A hard life. Honest terms." Eliza gestured toward Emma. "My younger daughter." "With respect," Cole said evenly, "I'd like permission to court Ruth." The silence was complete. Emma's smile froze, cracked, fell. Eliza stared as if she'd misheard. Ruth stood 20 paces away, wood chips clinging to her skirt, her hands still. Her name echoed in her ears like a mistake. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. Cole crossed the yard and stopped in front of her. He didn't tower, didn't soften. "Because you work," he said. "Because you don't pretend. Because you don't quit." "I'm not pretty," Ruth said flatly. "I'm not looking for pretty." She met his gaze, held it. "Can you survive?" he asked. "Yes." "Then that's enough." Eliza swallowed hard. Logic battled shock. Survival won. "You have my permission," she said. Cole nodded. "I'll return in 3 days." Quote. He mounted and rode out. Emma turned away without a word. Eliza looked at Ruth like she'd never truly seen her. And Ruth stood alone in the cooling light, heart hammering, wondering if she'd just been chosen. Or mistaken. Jacob Thornton's words echoed in Sarah's mind long after he had ridden off, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the distance. She stood there, wood chips still clinging to her dress, and tried to make sense of it all. Had he really meant what he said? It felt like a dream, something too strange, too impossible to grasp. He had looked at her, really looked at her, and for reasons that didn't make sense to her, he'd chosen her. Sarah shook her head slowly, her thoughts a swirl of confusion. Her mother, Margaret, hadn't said much after Jacob's departure. There was no gushing approval or excitement. Instead, Margaret had retreated into herself, sitting at the table with a distant look in her eyes. Sarah was used to being overlooked, used to being the one who stayed behind, in the shadows. She was used to being invisible. But now, with this strange offer hanging over her, it felt like everything was shifting beneath her feet. The morning light broke through the pine trees, casting soft shadows across the yard. The day was already heavy with the scent of damp earth and dew-laden grass. As the sun rose higher, Sarah moved through her routine, keeping her hands busy, not giving herself the time to dwell on things she couldn't control. But even the rhythmic sound of the axe striking wood couldn't stop the whirl of thoughts in her mind. Why had Jacob chosen her? What was his true intention? Was it really for survival, for practicality, as he had said? Or was there something more? She sighed, rubbing her hands over her face. She had spent so many years watching Lily capture the attention of every man who passed through their post. And now, here she was, picked. But not for the reasons Lily might have hoped, or anyone else for that matter. It wasn't for her beauty. It wasn't because she was young, or charming, or delicate. It was because she was practical. She could work, could survive, could make a home when things were rough. Sarah wasn't foolish. She knew exactly what this offer meant. There was no romance, no love in Jacob's eyes when he spoke to her. But there was something deeper, something she hadn't expected. Respect. Respect for her strength, her reliability, her ability to weather storms, both literal and emotional. Margaret came outside later that morning, her steps slow and purposeful as she moved towards Sarah, her eyes heavy with unspoken words. "You understand what you agreed to?" Margaret's voice was low, careful. Sarah nodded, not meeting her mother's eyes. She was still too lost in her thoughts to face the woman who had shaped her life. "I agreed to let him court me, not to marry him," she replied evenly. Margaret's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You'll expect marriage," she said, her tone firm but resigned. "Men like him don't court for fun." "I know," Sarah answered quietly. "Then What would you have had me say? Margaret pressed. No? No, Sarah said, lifting her chin slightly. He asked, and I couldn't say no, not when I know this is the only chance we have. Margaret's face was tight with something, grief perhaps. I'd planned for Lily. I thought it would be her, but… Sarah gave a small, understanding nod. I know, she said softly, but he didn't ask for her. A silence hung between them, thick and heavy, as both women pondered the future that was now set in motion. For Sarah, there was a sense of inevitability, as if she had always known this would be her path. Never the chosen one, never the first pick, but the one who would make do, who would survive. That afternoon, Jacob Thornton rode back into the clearing as promised, the sound of his horse's hooves steady, like the rhythm of something already fated. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had expected him to appear again, but now that he was here, the reality of it felt so much more immediate. He wasn't here for Lily, for the beauty that had charmed so many men before him. He was here for her, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on her like the cold, hard earth beneath her boots. Margaret greeted him with a nervous smile, her hands folded in front of her as if to hold herself together. Mr. Thornton, thank you for coming back. We've prepared something to eat. Jacob dismounted with the same calm, practiced ease as before, his boots making a soft thud on the dirt as he landed on the ground. He looked at Margaret first, a respectful nod, then at Sarah. His gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary before he turned to the porch, ready to follow Margaret inside. Sarah, he said, his voice deep, a tone she couldn't quite place. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. I have come to speak plainly with you. Sarah straightened up, her heart racing in her chest. This was it, the moment when everything would either be confirmed or completely upended. She didn't know which she was hoping for, but the sensation of her pulse in her throat was undeniable. Jacob led her away from the house, away from the prying eyes of Margaret and the tension that had already begun to settle over the post. The two of them walked in silence, their footsteps muffled in the soft earth as they approached the creek. He stopped by the water, watching the current swirl past. This isn't about love, he said quietly, not the way most folks see it. I've made mistakes in my life, and I'm not looking to repeat them. But what I'm offering is simple. A partnership, a way to make life work when it's hard. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the blunt truth that she had been expecting. It wasn't about hearts or dreams. It was about survival, and that meant something, more than she had ever thought it would. I know the kind of life I lead, Jacob continued, his gaze flicking to her face. It's a hard one, a lonely one, but it's real. And if you can stand that, then we'll make something of it. You'll be more than useful. You'll be my partner. In everything. Sarah looked at him, his face unreadable, his stance solid and sure. This wasn't the way she had dreamed of finding a man. But in this world, on this land, with these harsh conditions, was there ever any room for dreams? She hesitated only a moment, then nodded. I understand. Jacob's face softened, just slightly. Good. And so, in the quiet of the mountain air, in the heart of the land that had shaped them both, the first unspoken agreement was made. The days leading up to Jacob Thornton's return passed in a haze for Sarah. She had gone through the motions, feeding the animals, tending to the garden, working the small patch of earth she had cultivated behind the cabin, but it all felt distant. Each task was done with a mechanical precision, but her mind was always somewhere else, drifting back to that first conversation with him, his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud that refused to break. Her mother, Margaret, was no comfort. She was distant, wrapped up in her own thoughts as she managed the accounts of the failing post. The only time Sarah saw her truly alive was when she spoke of Lily's future, trying to find a way to save the post by marrying her off to someone with enough money to fix what Duncan Hartwell had left behind. But the more Sarah listened, the more she felt the bitter sting of being overlooked. Not by Jacob. He had chosen her, but by the world she had always lived in. On the morning of Jacob's return, Sarah was up before dawn, like always, preparing the fire and boiling water for coffee. The sky was pale blue, the kind of light that only the mountains could create. It was a stark, clean blue, heavy with the promise of a warm day, but the weight of the past few days hung around her shoulders like a heavy blanket. When she finally saw him ride in, there was no fanfare, no joyful greeting. Jacob simply rode in with the same steady pace, his eyes scanning the post, the yard, the familiar surroundings, as if they were nothing more than just another stop on his long, lonely journey. His presence was comforting in a way Sarah hadn't anticipated. The world felt quieter when he was near, less uncertain, as though with him things could make sense, even if they weren't perfect. He dismounted without a word, his boots heavy on the porch boards, and tied his horse to the rail. "Morning," he said simply, his voice warm but steady, the same as it had been the first time he spoke to her. There was no softening, no sweetness. It was just direct, like everything with Jacob. Margaret was already inside, putting the final touches on the stew, and Sarah moved to the side, giving him space to enter. Her stomach was tight. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. She wasn't even sure what she wanted. Inside, the meal was already prepared. Venison stew and freshly baked bread, the simple staples of their mountain life. Jacob sat at the table, his large frame filling the chair with ease. Margaret moved to serve him, her face expressionless, but Sarah noticed the way her hands shook just slightly as she set the bowl of stew in front of him. Sarah stayed near the doorway, her hands folding and unfolding the cloth she had been using to clean the counter. She wasn't sure if Jacob expected her to speak, but she didn't have anything to say. Not yet. She wasn't ready for whatever conversation was coming. Jacob took a slow breath before speaking again. "I know you didn't expect this. I didn't either, but here we are." He glanced at Sarah, his eyes a little softer than before. "I said I needed someone practical, someone who could stand by my side when things get hard. That hasn't changed." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. He wasn't offering her anything he hadn't already said. He wasn't offering romance or affection or tenderness. What he was offering was respect. The kind of respect she had spent her entire life trying to earn. Margaret, ever the practical woman, had her eyes fixed on Jacob. She studied him, weighing his every word, his every movement. Finally, she spoke. "You're sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with something Sarah couldn't quite name. "You understand what you're asking for?" "I do," Jacob replied, his tone sure. "I've lived my life alone long enough. This isn't about what I want, Mrs. Hartwell. This is about what's needed." His eyes flicked back to Sarah, and there it was again. Respect. Sarah's the kind of woman who knows what needs doing. That's why I'm here. The weight of his words settled in Sarah's chest. This wasn't a dream or a fantasy or a fairy tale. This was reality. And the reality was that Jacob Thornton had chosen her, not because of any soft affection, but because she was strong enough to survive beside him. "I'm willing to try," Sarah said, her voice firmer than she felt. Jacob's eyes met hers again, and for the briefest of moments, something passed between them. It was the smallest shift, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a silent understanding. After a long pause, Margaret spoke again. "I'll allow it," she said, her voice tight but resigned. "But know this, Sarah. This is your choice now. You can back out if you want, but if you go through with it, you'll have to live with it." Quote. Sarah nodded. She wasn't backing out. She never had been. It had taken her years to accept that she was the one left behind, the one who wasn't noticed. But now, with Jacob, that didn't matter anymore. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Jacob and Sarah made their way down the dirt path toward the creek. The air had a cool edge to it, the first hint of autumn creeping into the mountain air. The quietness of the moment felt different than before, the weight of their words settling between them like something tangible. They reached the creek and stopped by the water, standing in silence for a moment before Jacob spoke again. "I meant what I said," he began, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the rushing water. "This isn't easy for me, but I'm offering you something real. A partnership, respect. It's not about love, not like people think, but it's honest." "I understand," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "And that's all I can give. he added, his voice rough around the edges. "I've made mistakes before, Sarah. I'm not a man of words, but I'm a man of action. And what I need, what I want, is someone who can stand beside me and not break when the snow's deep and the days are long." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind working through everything he had said. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't what Jacob had just given her. He wasn't offering her dreams or promises. He was offering her a future built on the kind of honesty she had never been given before. "I'll stand by you," she said finally, her voice soft but full of certainty. "I can do that." Jacob's eyes softened for the first time since their conversation began, and for the briefest of moments, Sarah thought she saw something like a flicker of hope. "Good," he said simply. "Then we'll see where it goes." As they stood there in the fading light, the sound of the creek rushing beside them, it felt like the start of something. Not a fairy tale, but something real. Something grounded in the tough, unyielding land they both called home. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet, steady moments. Jacob was up before dawn every morning, checking his traps, hunting, or doing the endless work that kept him alive in the mountains. Sarah had settled into the routine of managing the post, keeping the fire burning and preparing meals, but there was something different in the air now. She felt his presence more keenly, the weight of his intentions settling like a storm cloud on the horizon. He would return each evening, sometimes with meat from his hunt or other supplies he had gathered. He was steady, reliable, a man who didn't waste time with words. But the silence between them was a constant companion, a quiet understanding that neither of them tried to break. One evening, Sarah found herself sitting by the fire, stitching a tear in one of Jacob's shirts. She had grown accustomed to the work, fixing things, making sure everything was in order. It was what she was good at. But as she worked, she couldn't help but think about what Jacob had said the day he came to her, about what he couldn't offer her. She understood, of course. He had made it clear that he couldn't offer her love, not like she had always dreamed of, but there was something about his presence, something steady and real, that made her question what love really was. Was it the sweet words and the soft gestures that Lily always seemed to get? Or was it something deeper, something forged in the fires of survival, where promises were made not with words, but with actions? Sarah looked up from her work and found Jacob standing in the doorway, his dark eyes taking in the sight of her. She felt a flutter in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. It was a strange feeling, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "Evening," Jacob said, his voice low but warm. "Evening," Sarah replied, her fingers pausing in their work. He stepped inside, his movements as sure and deliberate as always. There was a quiet strength about him that she admired, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. He wasn't flashy or charming like the men who had passed through their post over the years. He was just there, solid, dependable. After a long moment, he spoke again. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice careful, "about this, about us." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She set the shirt down in her lap, her hands suddenly still. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to expect from him, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for anything more. Not yet. Jacob seemed to sense her hesitation. He moved to sit across from her by the fire, his eyes not meeting hers but focused on the flames as he spoke. "I know this isn't what you thought it would be," he continued, his words measured, steady. "It's not what I thought either. I came here for a practical reason. I needed a partner, someone who could handle the rough days and long winters. But I didn't expect to find someone who could make it feel like more." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. More? Was he saying what she thought he was saying? She didn't know how to respond, so she stayed quiet, watching him as he spoke, letting his words sink in. "I'm not good with words, Sarah," he said, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "But I'm better with actions. And I know I've said it before, but I need you to know that this, what we're building, it's real." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can see that." He didn't speak again for a moment, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken things. The fire crackled and popped, filling the space with its warmth. Finally, Jacob spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I want you to know, I don't take this lightly. I may not have known how to say it before, but I'm not just looking for a woman to cook my meals or tend my house. I'm looking for a partner, someone who can stand beside me through all of it." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so long feeling overlooked even by her own family, that hearing Jacob's words, simple, direct, but filled with something real, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seen. Valued. "I don't expect much," Jacob continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I don't have much to offer, but what I do have, I'm giving to you. A life built on what's real, not on what people expect or dream about." Sarah's heart ached, not with sorrow, but with something deeper, hope. She had never allowed herself to hope for anything more than survival. She had never thought that someone like Jacob could offer her anything beyond the simple, practical things that had always defined her life. But here he was, offering her something more. A life built on respect, on partnership, on reality. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She stood, moving towards him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but she knew that this was a moment she couldn't let slip away. "Jacob," she said, her voice a little shaky but filled with resolve. "I'm willing to stand beside you. For whatever comes." Jacob's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Sarah saw something in them that was unmistakable, something like tenderness. Not love, not in the way she had always imagined it, but something that had the power to grow into something even stronger. "Good," he said, his voice thick with something Sarah couldn't quite name. He held out his hand, and without thinking she took it, feeling the warmth of his calloused fingers close around hers. It was a simple gesture, one that could have meant nothing, but in that moment it felt like everything. They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped together, neither of them speaking. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls, as if the very house were holding its breath. Outside, the mountains stood silent and still, as if waiting for the world to shift just a little bit more. Sarah couldn't help but feel that in that moment, something had changed. Not just in her, but in Jacob too. They were no longer strangers standing on opposite sides of a world that had separated them. They were partners now, bound together not by sweet promises or fleeting affection, but by something more durable, something that would hold when the winds blew cold, when the days grew long and harsh. The future was uncertain, yes, but as Sarah stood there with Jacob, hands joined, she knew one thing for sure. They would face it together. The days following Jacob's declaration were quieter than Sarah expected, though no less filled with work. The rhythm of life in the high country was unyielding. Mornings came early, and the tasks never stopped. Tending the garden, maintaining the cabin, checking the traps, preparing meals, keeping the fire fed and the animals cared for. But despite the weight of the endless chores, there was a shift between them. A subtle, almost imperceptible change that both Sarah and Jacob could feel, though neither spoke of it. They worked side by side, day in and day out, building something solid with their hands. There was no romantic declaration, no sweet promises exchanged between them. What there was instead was the quiet trust of two people finding their way in a world that didn't make room for dreams. At night, after the work was done, they would sit by the fire, each lost in their own thoughts, the crackle of the flames filling the silence. Occasionally, Sarah would catch Jacob looking at her with something unreadable in his eyes, but she didn't ask. She wasn't sure if she was ready to ask. One evening, as autumn's chill began to creep into the air, Jacob returned from checking his traps earlier than usual. His face was drawn, his posture tense. Sarah looked up from where she was preparing dinner, instinctively sensing that something was different. "You all right?" she asked, her voice quiet but concerned. Jacob didn't immediately respond. He stood by the door for a long moment, taking in the warm, dim glow of the cabin. Finally, he removed his hat, his fingers running through his dark hair before he spoke. "Things are getting harder out there," he said, his voice rough, like he'd been carrying a weight for far too long. "The weather's turning. Traps aren't as good as they should be. The food's running low, and the mountain's growing colder than usual." Sarah could see it in his face. The land, which had always been unforgiving, was now pushing back harder. Jacob was a man of the mountains, used to its moods, its challenges. But even he couldn't always predict when things would turn against him. "We'll make it through," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the unease that was beginning to stir in her own chest. She stood up, moving toward him, and for the first time, Jacob let her. She placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I'll help," she added. "We'll get through this." He looked down at her, his eyes filled with something, a mix of gratitude and something else, something harder to place. His eyes flicked to the fire and back to her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a rare thing, this silence between them, a rare pause in their otherwise steady rhythm. But Jacob was already turning his attention to the fire, lifting a log onto the hearth. "It's not just the mountain," he said quietly. "The people around here, they're changing too. Not everyone's happy with us, Sarah. With this?" Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She hadn't fully considered how the outside world would react to the union of the two of them. Two people from different worlds, different expectations. Her heart had been focused on survival, on getting through each day. But what Jacob said made her realize something she had missed. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. "There are those who don't like me, and there are those who don't like you either," he replied, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "They've got their own ideas about how things should be. They don't like a woman like you in my life, someone strong, someone who doesn't follow the rules they expect. And they especially don't like a man like me, choosing you." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had never been the one to catch the attention of others. Always in Lily's shadow, always the invisible one. But now, the notion of standing at Jacob's side felt like a shield, something that would protect her as much as it would protect him. "I'm not scared of them," she said firmly, her voice a little stronger than she felt. "And neither are you, I know." Quote. Jacob's lips twisted slightly, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, we're not," he agreed. "But I want you to be prepared. We may have to fight for this, for what we've built. There are people who don't understand why I picked you. There are people who think I should have picked someone else." Sarah turned her gaze toward the fire. The flames flickered and danced, as if mocking her doubts. She had known hardship all her life. She had been overlooked, passed over for things that seemed out of reach. But now, with Jacob beside her, there was a part of her that was ready to fight for the life they were building, for the respect they were earning together. "I don't care what they think," she said softly, her words steady, though her heart raced in her chest. "What we have is real, it's ours. And if they don't see it, that's their problem." Jacob looked at her for a long time, his gaze intense. And in that moment, she felt it. Something that she hadn't felt before. Something that made her heart race, that made her breath catch. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was real. It was the kind of connection forged in the fire of survival, in the shared struggles, and the shared, quiet moments. It was stronger than anything she had known. Jacob nodded slowly, a rare moment of appreciation flashing across his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's ours, no one else's." They stood there in the firelight, neither of them moving, as if the moment had stretched out, each of them holding onto it in their own way. For the first time since they had met, Sarah felt a deep, steady certainty settle in her chest. This was the life she was choosing. This was the life she would fight for. The following morning, the quiet tension that had settled between them the night before seemed to lift, but there was a new energy in the air, a shared determination. As the sun climbed higher, they began their work as usual, Sarah tending to the garden, Jacob checking his traps, but there was something different about their movements. There was purpose behind every step, every task. Later, Jacob came back from his traps with only a few small catches, but it didn't matter. He wasn't concerned with the quantity of the catch. He was concerned with the future, with what lay ahead. "I've got an idea," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet of the cabin as he unpacked his gear. We'll need to head up toward the higher passes. The hunting's better there, and we can stock up for the winter." Sarah nodded, not questioning the decision. There was a certain relief in his plan. It was a direction, a purpose, and she was ready for it. Ready for whatever came next. And as the days grew colder, as the winds began to howl and the mountain passed into the long grip of winter, Jacob and Sarah moved forward. Together. Winter came early that year. The mountains, which had always held a quiet beauty in the warmer months, now stood silent and severe, their peaks blanketed in snow, the wind howling through the trees. The once gentle streams had turned into frozen veins of ice, and the ground itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the coming of the long, brutal season. Inside the cabin, Sarah and Jacob worked side by side, preparing for what they knew would be a long, hard winter. They stocked up on meat, dried herbs, and the supplies they had gathered during the fall. There was no time for idle thoughts or regrets. Every task was done with purpose, with the weight of survival pressing down on them. But despite the cold, despite the looming threat of winter, there was something different now. A warmth, not from the fire but from within, something that had grown between them over the past months. They were no longer just two people sharing space in the mountains. They had become partners in the truest sense of the word. They shared every task, every worry, every victory, no matter how small. Sarah no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt overlooked. She had a place in this world, a place beside Jacob, where her strength was seen and valued. And, for the first time in her life, she knew that she mattered. That the things she had always done, working the land, making a home, providing for those around her, were more than enough. Still, there was something lingering in the air. Something unspoken between them. It wasn't that the connection wasn't there. It was there, in every shared glance, every quiet moment by the fire. It was the kind of bond that spoke louder than words. But there was still a question, an uncertainty, hanging just out of reach. It was late one night, after they had finished their work and the cabin had settled into its quiet routine, that Jacob finally spoke the words that had been on both of their minds. They sat by the fire, the only light in the cabin coming from the soft, flickering flames. Sarah had been mending a tear in one of Jacob's coats, her hands moving with the ease of someone who had spent years working with her hands. Jacob was sharpening his knife, his movements deliberate, each stroke of the blade filled with purpose. "I never thought I'd find myself here," Jacob said quietly, his voice low, rough from days spent out in the cold. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze. She had heard him say similar things before, about how his life had led him here, how he had never expected to find someone like her. But tonight, there was something in his voice that made her heart beat a little faster. "You've found more than you thought, haven't you?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob paused, the knife still in his hand. His gaze softened, and for the first time, Sarah saw something that she had never seen in him before, something vulnerable. "I've found everything I need," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a depth that Sarah couldn't ignore. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah processed his words. He wasn't just speaking of survival anymore. He was speaking of something more, of what they had built together, of the bond that had grown between them, steady and sure, over time. Her heart beat faster as she stood slowly, moving toward him. The firelight flickered in her eyes, casting shadows across her face, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed vast. But as she closed the distance, as she stood in front of him, Jacob set the knife down and reached out. His hand found hers, strong and sure. "Jacob," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "What is this? What are we doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he brought her hand to his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his worn shirt. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Sarah could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. But then, Jacob's voice broke the silence. "We're building a life," he said simply, his eyes locking onto hers. "A life built on what's real. What we've built here, it's more than enough." Sarah felt a rush of emotion fill her chest. It wasn't the sweet, romantic love she had once dreamed of. But it was something far more enduring. It was respect. It was partnership. It was the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures or declarations. It was the quiet, steady kind that grew in the spaces between the work, between the quiet moments by the fire. "I want this," Sarah said, her voice steady now. "I want us. I want this life." Jacob's gaze softened even further, and for the first time he took her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, a rare tenderness in the roughness of his hands. He looked at her as if he were seeing her properly for the first time. "I want you, Sarah," he said, his voice low, raw with emotion, "in ways I never thought I could want anyone. I never planned for this, but I'm glad it's you." Her heart swelled in her chest, and she felt something deep inside her shift. This was it. This was what she had always wanted, though she hadn't known it. This was the love she had never dreamed she could have, the love that was built on something real. Without a word, Jacob leaned forward, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was soft, tentative at first, as if they were both still testing the waters. But as they kissed, it deepened, both of them feeling the years of unspoken words, the weight of their shared struggles, and the quiet promise of a future together. When they finally pulled apart, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, the warmth of the flames, a reflection of the warmth they felt inside. Sarah's heart raced, and as she looked into Jacob's eyes, she knew that, for the first time in her life, she was truly seen. Not for her beauty, not for her strength, but for the person she was, the person she had always been. "I never thought I could have this," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, but full of truth. "I never thought I could be enough." "You are," Jacob replied, his voice filled with certainty. "You're everything." They stayed like that, holding each other, the world outside frozen in its winter grip. But inside, the warmth of the fire, the warmth of their bond, was enough to keep them going. The days passed, the snow continued to fall, and the world outside remained cold. But inside that little cabin, something had shifted. Something had grown that neither of them could have predicted. And though the future was still uncertain, one thing was clear. They would face it together as partners, as something more than just survivors. They had built something real, and that was enough. As the months wore on, their life in the mountains became their own. Sarah had never imagined that a man like Jacob would choose her, a woman who had spent so much of her life in the shadows, unseen. But in choosing her, he had shown her that she was worth more than she had ever known. In time, the cold turned to spring, the snow melted away, and the mountains began to soften their grip. But Sarah and Jacob's bond, their quiet love, remained unshaken. They had found something in each other that they had never expected, something real, something lasting, and together they built a future that no one could take away. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.